Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel. It's wonderful to be here. Before I start, I wanted to send a thank you out to the Linda Hall Library for inviting us all to be here this evening and for putting together such a beautiful and creative exhibit on the search for life beyond Earth. Truly, if you haven't had a chance to see it, please spend some time looking around and reading the information. It's just fantastic. Of course, this panel is part of the programming that's related to that exhibit, and so I'd like to spend a couple of minutes connecting the dots between the topic of our panel and the search for alien life. I think it's wonderful that you have chosen to celebrate the history and the evolution of a question that I think many of us are innately interested in, which is, are we alone? Is anyone else out there? And of course, this is a question that until relatively recently lived mostly within the realms of philosophy, speculative, or science fiction, and not so much within science. But now we are lucky to be living in an age where looking for life beyond Earth is a priority among the science community as well. And Dad had calculated that his telescope, this one, was sensitive enough to detect those signals if they were at least as strong as what we on Earth were emitting. And of course, the only technologies that he found evidence for were our own terrestrial technologies. But in 1961, the next year, he codified that reasoning that I just walked you through into what we now know as the Drake equation, which calculates how many civilizations there are how many detectable civilizations there are in the Milky Way galaxy. That's our galaxy. And it's not an equation in the same sense as something like E equals mc squared. It's more of a framework that you can use to answer really big questions. Because as you step through each of these variables, they challenge you to figure out what you need to know if you want to keep moving down that path toward an answer. And so depending on how optimistic you are and what you think the values of these variables are, the Drake equation tells us that the number of detectable civilizations in the Milky Way is somewhere between 1, which is us, and potentially billions. So what does that have to do with the topic of our panel tonight, which is unidentified anomalous phenomena within a scientific context? Well, in any field of science, there is a boundary between what we know and what we don't know. And some would argue that in the search for life beyond Earth, UAP live at that boundary. And by UAP, of course, I'm referring to the objects in our skies that were formerly known as UFOs, and which by definition are unidentified. But in literature and in history, we humans have associated UFOs with aliens, with the alien, the otherworldly, the unknown. And in some ways, they have come to represent the ways in which we deal with ambiguity and how we make sense of things that we really cannot explain. And today, the term UAP has evolved to include any objects that we don't understand that exist in space and underwater, as well as in the skies. Now, if you go back to the Drake equation and you think about everything that we're learning about exoplanets, which are planets that orbit other stars, about habitable environments, about life's tenacity here on Earth, about the distribution of life's building blocks in the cosmos, you might rightly conclude that the probability that in this vast galaxy we inhabit, the probability that alien life exists is probably pretty darn high, right? And you might wonder, well, are there any aliens nearby? Have they maybe visited us? There is actually an intellectual continuum there that connects those dots. Now, plenty of people certainly believe that we have found evidence of extraterrestrial life here on Earth already. In 2021, a Pew Research poll found that roughly 2/3 of Americans think that intelligent aliens exist on other planets, and that 51% think that we have already found evidence or probably found evidence of those technologies here on Earth. That the UFOs that the US military has identified are either definitely or probably evidence of alien technologies. That's 51%. So how do we get down to the business of understanding what these UAP are? That is what our panel is going to address tonight, how we can figure out the provenances of these objects that we see in our skies, in space, and underwater. We're going to step away from the stigma and the sensationalism and the hyperbole that often accompanies discussions of UAP and think about how we can harness the power of the scientific method to intentionally and rigorously and objectively collect the data that we need to understand these objects that really could be living at the boundary of what we think we know about the distribution of life in the cosmos. And even if we don't find out anything interesting about them, we'll at least learn something interesting about ourselves and our world in the process. Okay, so for this first round of questions, I wanted to chat with each of you about the way in which you relate to the phenomenon of UAP. And it strikes me that you each look at that through a different lens. Josh through the lens of science, Alex as an eyewitness, and Greg through the lens of history. So I'd like to hear a little bit from each of you about what that does. So Alex, maybe you can start off by telling us about your encounter with the Tic Tac.
Sure. I graduated and commissioned through the ROTC program in 2001, went through flight school, had my first flight on 9/11, which was a paradigm shift for the world and for me personally and professionally. And then I ended up in the strike fighter pipeline. So I flew F-18 Super Hornets for the Navy off of the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier from the squadron VFA 41. So we were stationed in Lemoore, California, and we would join the ship for our pre-deployment workups and then our deployments westbound to the Gulf at the time. So in 2004, I had just joined the squadron a few months earlier, very junior pilot, and just trying to be safe, just trying to hang on. When we launched on a routine training exercise from the carrier off the coast of California, and it was the middle of the day, it was clear blue skies, calm waters, and we were planning to go do an exercise, a scrimmage of sorts. And we were redirected by an air traffic controller within our carrier strike group. So they were on a different ship, but they were part of our exercise. And they gave us vectors to intercept a real-world contact. So 2004, just a few years after 9/11, the hair on the back of our neck stood up. We thought, what's going on? I had no idea what was going on, being the most junior person on the flight. It was myself flying. I had a weapons systems officer in the back seat, a lieutenant commander, so more senior officer, and a more experienced aviator. I'm on the wing of the commanding officer of the squadron. He's flying, and he has a senior lieutenant in his back seat. So we have 4 folks in 2 aircraft, and as we're vectored, I say to my Wizzo, I say, what do you think is going on? He says, I don't know, could be somebody running drugs up the coast from Mexico. I said, oh, that's cool, that's exciting. We're gonna go do something. We had 0 weapons on board. There's nothing we could do about it. It's not like we were gonna shoot at anything. But we proceeded to the merge, and the air traffic controller who had this radar picture said, hey, you're at merge plot, right? So the little blips on their screen were coming together as one. And so we look outside and we expect to see something. We couldn't see anything outside. One of the 4 of us spots a disturbance in the water. So there's some sort of churning white water activity where there's otherwise calm waters. I said, oh no, whatever we were chasing, whoever we were hunting, has crashed and is sinking. But before I could think that, enter stage left, the Tic Tac. We call it affectionately Tic Tac, like the little white breath mint, because that's what it looked like on a much larger scale. So our estimates is that it was about the size of one of our fuselage, so the body of the aircraft. But it was moving in a way that we couldn't recognize. It didn't follow our laws of physics. It didn't have our turn radius or our acceleration. All of the things that we train to master in our own cockpits and then go up against similar and dissimilar aircraft when we are in aerial combat maneuvering or basic fighter maneuvering, dogfighting in the air. So lots of expletives on the radio, lots of, what the heck is that? And then we lost sight of it. It just disappeared. The radar operator, the air traffic controller, comes on the radio and says, hey, you're not going to believe this, but it's at your cap point. So it's 50, 60 miles away from where we were at. Now, I don't know whether it was the same thing or whether it was a similar radar contact that popped up maybe out of the water. I don't want to speculate on that. We get back to the ship. We're excited. There's something out there. We don't know what it is. We can't explain it. And another aircraft from our squadron launched and was able to, and this is a testament to their acumen, they were able to get the FLIR footage, that's the forward-looking infrared, grainy black and white footage that is often associated with the USS Nimitz Tic-Tac encounter. So we had both visual eyewitnesses, we had the sophisticated sensor, we had the radar, which is its own type of state-of-the-art equipment, and the bringing to bear an entire military carrier strike fighter group could not, in that moment, figure out what it was in the middle of a military operating area off the coast of a densely populated U.S. city. So excited in the moment, frustrated in the aftermath with the lack of follow-up, follow-through, and investigation. Happy to answer questions when we're to that point.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. One more quick question for you, which struck me from the conversation that we had, I guess, last week, was that you said that you've remained aggressively neutral about what it is that you saw.
So whenever people ask me, what do you think you saw? And I said, well, I don't know. That's why it was so weird. And I maintain an aggressively neutral stance. So by definition, for me, UFO or UAP is unidentified. That's what the U stands for. And so I have a background in engineering. I went to a math and science academy for high school. My family has a tradition of science, and I'm open-minded. That's why we do science, of course. We're curious and we want to explore. But I also need to ground that curiosity in facts and data and analysis. And so I think it's really important to go about it in a systematic way. And so that's why I agreed to speak here today and do other interviews, because I want to advocate for having a systematic approach and doing the work that needs to be done in order to answer all these questions that we have.
Yeah, thank you. Josh, I'm going to stick with you for one more second. I'm going to try to back up and put our title slide back up.
Oh.
No, you're good. When we were talking last week, you had said that, if we're approaching UAP from a scientific context, which I think we're all very interested in doing, we need better data. And then you followed that up by saying, and we can now be pretty specific by what we mean when we say that we need better data. So maybe I'll start with you here and then open it up. What kind of data are you talking about? What do we need?
Yeah, so we have a lot of distributed sensor networks out there for other purposes that we can leverage and exploit for the study of anomalous phenomena, right? And one system that we talked about on the UAP panel is the NEXRAD weather radar system. We have these radar systems spinning around, like the type you see on the top of your boat. A lot of you probably have boats, right? And we have these things that you can find the maps online. And if you have a sighting, whether it be by just an interested citizen or anything like that, there's no excuse for not being able to go back to the NEXRAD data and look for pings off of the object. And what has to be done oftentimes is not a full-on from scratch investment of a new facility, but let's look at what we have and see how we can better use it. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, citizen science is also an important part of this. Mm-hmm. Citizens, I don't know if I could talk about that a little bit.
I think I'll Maybe hold that one for later, but
Oh, yeah, we'll
yeah,
come back
it's
to
just
that.
thinking about what kinds of observations we might want. And Alex, I'm actually really curious about your take on this one too, because you did have an experience where I'm sure if the opportunity had arose, you would have wanted to gather more information about the object that you saw.
Yeah, I was really surprised that we didn't pause the exercise, that we didn't do a training timeout and re-divert all of the assets that we had available in that moment to investigate, to shine a light and say, maybe this is an adversary, maybe this is somebody, trundling through the middle of a military exercise off the coast of California. Maybe we should figure out who this is or what it is. And instead, everyone did a collective shrug and said, that was weird. Okay, back to work, back to the mission at hand, which was getting ready to go, provide close air support to troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. So another reason that I speak about this is to help reduce the stigma and to say to folks, hey, if you see something, you should say something. But the problem then is, where do I report? How do I report? What do I report? So I think that we all have now these Ring doorbell cameras. We're posting great videos of our package delivery people interacting with our cats. But they're also capturing weird things happening in the sky. There was a flurry of activity near me in Boulder where I was getting a barrage of what is this? What do you think this is? And it was all these doorbell camera footages. It turns out that there was a meteor that struck and or didn't. Was the meteor right? Is when it strikes. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, it created this spectacular seed in the sky. And as people should, they captured and sort of tried to direct their evidence into a central place. My LinkedIn message box is not necessarily the right place to do that analysis. But wouldn't it be great if we had an agency or a whole of government approach, which is part of what the NASA independent study said, is this DoD responsibility? Is this an issue of national security? Is this NASA's responsibility? Is this, for science? And the FAA had a seat at the table, and they said, hey, what about flight safety, which of course is top of mind for us in the last several weeks with all of our mishaps. So if there was something in the airspace when you're getting on your next flight, Delta or United flight out of here, wouldn't you like to have the confidence that the airspace is clear and anything that's unidentified is accounted for?
I would like that.
I would.
Yeah, I mean, if I could piggyback on that, I actually have a question really for all three of you or any of you who want to answer it. I think for a lot of folks, a lot of us lay folks, we don't know the difference between the alphabet soup of Aero, FAA, NASA. If you're an insider, you know that what these refer to. But do you have an answer for a lot of us that could give us a sense of how is, say, what Aero is doing different from what the charge NASA has been involved with and the FAA? How do you think of the difference between them? Because there's clearly some important differences there, right? Or do you just see this as all part of the same goulash of options?
Well, I'll start by saying, and this is me as a 20-year military officer, things that are collected on DoD systems, it might not be classified what we're looking at, right? If I snap a picture of the Hollywood sign on a FLIR in my F-18, the Hollywood sign is not classified, but the methods and means of capture might be classified. So that sophisticated technology that I use might then deem everything that's collected on it unavailable, unaccessible to those other agencies. So that's part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And the real big problem, once we say, okay, let's agree on how we're going to capture, archive, share out this info, the biggest problem is who's going to pay for it, right? Mm-hmm. Congress has to authorize and appropriate funds to make this happen. You've got to pay for the systems, you've got to pay for the storage, you've got to pay for the analysts to do their work. Everybody at the table says, oh,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Well, at NASA, they've really embraced this idea of research to operations, R2O, and O2R, operations to research.
So what does that mean?
And so what it means is that,
English.
exactly. I'm contributing to the alphabet soup. NASA has this entire mission around what they term space weather these days. So it is an agency that is into discovery science, but they also realize that there's a application for the data sets they record, from research to contribute to understanding why your GPS drops out, or understanding how the atmosphere expands and contracts and causes satellite drag that harms satellites. So energetic radiation from the sun disrupting electronics and satellites. So the connection is so tight and so valuable to exploit that they've developed an entire office around space weather. And I see that synergy, which is within the agency of NASA, maybe translating to DoD NASA collaborations, right? So, DoD is firmly interested in national security. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that the NASA office in charge of UAP, which there is one now, with one person, I believe.
One person.
But they are involved with finding the science behind things. And, the connection between the two is just so strong that there's always been NASA DoD collaborations, but this is one area where it really could pay benefit.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discussions we had on the study team were, what can NASA do that's complementary to what the DoD is doing? Because obviously, DoD is going to be a lot more concerned with national security, the implications there, and NASA has more flexibility to go and explore the discovery space, to think about doing science and what we might learn. I want to pivot a little bit. Greg, a question for you, because I've heard a couple of comments just in our discussion already about some of the stories that have been published that are relating information about UAP in the popular press. Josh, I think you said the New York Times article was meant to be a factual article, which I imagine you said with quite a bit of side-eye. As a journalist, let's go ahead and throw something on us. And Alex, you were talking about the stigma involved in reporting, and of course that's something that can be exacerbated in the press as well. So Greg, I'm curious about the role that you think the media has played in our understanding of UFOs historically. And then I know you have a slide related to that, but I also want us to start thinking from there, what can we do better? And how can we educate all of you, the consumers of information, to be smarter when it comes to reading these kinds of things?
Yeah. So in August of 1952, the South Bend Tribune in Indiana decided to put together what was called, that's a newspaper, put together what they called Operation Flying Saucer, which would be a night in August when the entire, all of South Bend would be mobilized to look for flying saucers. They got civil defense, military radar, police. They had a radio station attached to them. The radio station was broadcasting these things, and they had a hotline. You could call into the radio station if you saw something, and then they would announce it. Notre Dame Stadium had about 2,000 people in there with telescopes looking for things. Observers said there were people on roofs, in yards. And they came up with about 100 sightings that night that they then passed on to the Air Force. God knows what the Air Force did with it all. But I thought to myself, that is a great example of how media becomes part of the story. So I've got this slide. I don't know how to work that, if you don't mind, if that works. Of something.
Hello.
Let's see. Oops, we just skipped over.
There we go.
Is that it? I hope you could see that okay. So this is something I put together a few years ago. This runs from 1985 to 2014. So 25 U.S. newspapers, small, large, across the United States. I looked for headlines of stories that either had the term flying saucer, flying saucers in it, or UFO, UFOs in it. And this is what I came up with. If 2017 and 18 was there, you'd see another spike, by the way. I guarantee it. I once showed this chart to historians over at the National Air and Space Museum, and I said, so what do you make of this? And one of them said, quite brilliantly, she said, well, it's obvious. The aliens come every 10 years. But you do see these spikes, and we don't have time for this now. What I usually do when I show this to a group of intelligent people like yourselves, I ask you to try to figure out what is going on in 1987, what's going on in 1997, and what's going on in 2007. But I'll give away the gig. And the punchline is in 1987, 2 books come out. Bud Hopkins' Intruders and Whitley Strieber's Communion, the 2 best-selling books about alien abduction. Gets lots of news coverage. 1997, there was this thing called the Phoenix Lights that made some news, but the big news was a certain very tragic story about a religious community called Heaven's Gate, which some of you probably remember, in which several dozens of people committed suicide as part of a UFO cult. 2007 is the hardest to figure out, but you'd have to remember a presidential election and a certain Democratic candidate by the name of Dennis Kucinich, who ran for office and admitted that he had seen a UFO, and that was the end of his presidential run when he announced that. And that got a lot of coverage. So you can see that media coverage has cycles to it.
It does. And I wonder, open-ended question, what can we do better? I mean, I'm curious. Alex, we've talked about this.
I get a lot of requests for interviews. So that 2017 article came about, and there was a Pentagon report that, again, wasn't classified because we don't know what we saw that day, but included our names and information. And so it was released, posted on the internet somehow, and we were doxxed. So I get a flood of inquiries and invitations for all sorts of media and news outlets. I try my best to vet them and say who's sort of credible and worthwhile. I said yes to the BBC. I said no to TMZ. But even the serious reporters, either there's spooky music in the background or snickering and sort of, it's the lighthearted fun story. And that's really grating. That's really disappointing. You want to say, hey, yes, I saw something weird. We don't know what it was. I'm not crazy. I don't think any of you are crazy. And if you see something, do your best to capture it. Here's maybe a checklist or methodology to follow, a protocol. I get asked all sorts of great questions. Now, my favorite is, did you see a shadow? I have no idea. I wasn't looking for a shadow at the time, but what a great question. And so you can be sure if I see something else weird, I'm going to say, is there a shadow? Lots of other good questions. Let's capture that, and let's structure it in a way so that frontline operators, train conductors, long-haul truckers, people who might, that should be sober and might have an encounter because they're looking up and out, can then be that sensor, or at least send up a flag, send up a flare, and say, hey, there's something here, and then have the next steps in contacting first responders or Aero or whoever the right agency is to then say, okay, we're looking for a needle in the haystack, and at least this is the right part of the.
I'm curious, you were just mentioning a whole class of individuals who should be sober and are looking outside all the time. We talked a lot before about the role of citizen science, of, citizens literally are the ones who are seeing these objects. Maybe that's some of you. What can this audience do? What kind of data can this audience gather? Is there a role for citizen science in understanding UAP? I think all three of you have strong feelings on this one, so Josh, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, the problem with AI, for instance, is that it's easy to generate fake UAP events, and so we do have to kind of police against that, and citizen science has a natural way of doing that, right? If you have a network of people connected through social media, one of you sees something in the sky, hey, anybody else see this from this location? You know, you can imagine a scenario or even a habit that's developed where everybody goes out to see if they can. And if you get observations of an object from multiple locations, it's self-validating, right? It's really difficult to fake an event if it's viewed by 100 different people at 100 different locations. And the other valuable thing about that is that this gets to processing. If you want to know how fast an object is moving, I mentioned one way, which is a radar system. And another way to do it is just simply look at it from at least 3, 4, 5 different angles and go back to your trig book, and you realize that you can actually triangulate where that object is, do it as a function of time, and track its velocity. And all these people who claim that these strange little bugs flying around the sky in their camera are in the outer space regime, and they're kissing satellites and disappearing again and things like that. I mean, you'll know if those objects are actually at 1,000 kilometers altitude or if they're at 50 kilometers or lower. So it's not just that there's an opportunity. I almost feel like it's a complete necessity at this point, given where we're going with generative AI and the types of fakeries that you can develop.
So would you build a platform for cell phones or something where people could submit images, data, information like that?
Well, we have that kind of thing in other domains. A colleague of mine, Liz McDonald at Goddard, developed Aurorasaurus, which is it's a similar kind of thing. If you see a strange, Mother Nature makes exotic phenomena in the night sky as well. That's really interesting to study. And the aurora, it turns out, is a phenomenon we really don't understand very well. And so this is a platform for people who have collected pictures of the aurora. They can, log where they took it and put the data in there. And, we have entrepreneurial efforts to do that with UAP as well. We've been, Enigma, right?
Yeah, there's a few apps.
Okay.
I love the anecdote. This is a story out of Australia. I read the article. The whole town saw something. Purpley lights, it was glowing. Clearly this is a UFO crash, right? And they all called the sheriff, or whatever they call them down under, and the sheriff drove out on this long road towards the lights. Turns out it was a cannabis farm whose automatic shades had failed to go down at dusk. And so it was the grow lights that were reflecting off of a low cloud cover. But I love that they just said, hey, this is weird.
Yeah.
This looks weird, this looks funny. A bunch of folks are reporting it, and the sheriff said, this is weird, I'll go check it out. Right? Probably had his hand on the sidearm. And so that's the kind of approach we should say. We should say, the boomerang, yeah. Here's a little side kangaroo. That's how we should approach it. If people see something weird, you should take them seriously, and that you should back them up and investigate. And then there hopefully is a reasonable answer. But if there isn't, then let's get out there and
But does it? I mean, let me play devil's advocate, because I get a sense that we oftentimes there hasn't been enough respect shown witnesses for what they see, and even today you will still hear scientists who are researching this saying, the witnesses are okay, but let's get some data through sensors, right? So the instruments are always the key. So isn't it true that more information, raw information, isn't always helpful for the scientists? That the noise just drowns out the signal so much that, and as you say, particularly given the fact that the resources aren't there, the money is not there, the people aren't there to do it, the work, would it overburden what exists today if all that data was coming in and figuring out how you deal with it all, right? Wouldn't that be the case?
I think we have to merge the two. So just like police wearing body cams, right? They can have them running 24/7, but if they don't have that little button to push that says there's an incident here, and it captures 3 minutes before and 3 minutes after, you are looking for the needle in the haystack, right? You could have thousands of hours of data from the body cam, but if you don't have somebody flagging it and saying, look here. And I think at the NASA Independent Study Kickoff, we heard from the folks who were talking about the different satellites, right? They're the satellites that are going around and around, and they were saying this is how much we can cover, and this is how much storage space on our hard drive. At a certain point we have to overwrite, otherwise we run out of storage. And then there's the satellites that are fixed, that just look at one spot on the ground. So we have this assumption. Hollywood does this a disservice by making us think that everything, everywhere, all at once is being captured, but it's not. And so if I'm off the coast of California and I say, oh, it's November 14th, 2004 at 11 a.m., something weird's happening here, and the satellite's on the other side of the world, and I gotta wait for it to circle back around before we can even get the picture, right? What's the mechanism where we create a system of sensors and authorization to maybe look in people's backyards or within our own borders, but it's a whole nother issue of policy. And but the point is, it's been 20 years since my encounter, and the needle has moved barely a whisper in terms of coming up with a systematic approach, the agencies to lead the effort. But so glad to see so many people here today with genuine curiosity.